Early one morning, as the cock crew, Tous arose, and accompanied by Give and Guders and a company of horsemen, proceeded on a hunting excursion, not far from the banks of the J-Hoon, where, after ranging about the forest for some time, they happened to fall in with a damsel of extreme beauty, with smiling lips, blossoming cheeks, and fascinating mien. They said to her, "Never was seen so sweet a flower, in garden, vale, or fairy bower. The moon is on thy lovely face, thy cypress form is full of grace. But why, with charms so soft and meek, dost thou the lonely forest seek?" She replied that her father was a violent man, and that she had left her home to escape his anger. She had crossed the river J-Hoon, and had travelled several leagues on foot, in consequence of her horse being too much fatigued to bear her further. She had at the time been 3 days in the forest. On being questioned respecting her parentage, she said her father's name was Shivar, of the race of Feredun. Many sovereigns had been suitors for her hand, but she did not approve of one of them. At last he wanted to marry her to Pashang, the ruler of Turan, but she refused him on account of his ugliness and bad temper. This, she said, was the cause of her father's violence, and of her flight from home. But when his angry mood is over, he'll love his daughter as before, and send his horsemen far and near to take me to my mother dear. Therefore I would not further stray, but here without a murmur stay. The hearts of both Tous and Give were equally inflamed with love for the damsel, and each was equally determined to support his own pretensions, in consequence of which a quarrel arose between them. At length it was agreed to refer the matter to the king, and to abide by his decision. When, however, the king beheld the lovely object of contention, he was not disposed to give her to either claimant, but without hesitation took her to himself, after having first ascertained that she was of distinguished family and connection. In due time a son was born to him, who was, according to the calculations of the astrologers, of wonderful promise, and named Siavash. The prophecies about his surprising virtues, and his future renown, made Kavus anxious that justice should be done to his opening talents, and he was highly gratified when Rostam agreed to take him to Zabalestan, and there instruct him in all the accomplishments which were suitable to his illustrious rank. He was accordingly taught horsemanship and archery, how to conduct himself at banquets, how to hunt with the falcon and the leopard, and made familiar with the manners and duty of kings, and the hardy chivalry of the age. His progress in the attainment of every species of knowledge and science was surprising, and in hunting he never stooped to the pursuit of animals inferior to the lion or the tiger. It was not long before the youth felt anxious to pay a visit to his father, and Rostam, willingly complying with his wishes, accompanied his accomplished pupil to the royal court, where they were both received with becoming distinction. Siavash, having fulfilled Kavus's expectations in the highest degree, and the king's gratitude to the champion being in proportion to the eminent merit of his services on the interesting occasion. After this, however, preceptors were continued to enlighten his mind 7 years longer, and then he was emancipated from further application and study. One day, Surabeh, the daughter of the Shah of Hamavaran, happening to see Siavash sitting with his father, the beauty of his person made an instantaneous impression on her heart. The fire of love consumed her breast, the thoughts of him denied her rest. For him alone she pined in grief, from him alone she sought relief, and called him to her secret bower, to while away the passing hour. But Siavash refused the call, he would not shame his father's hall. The enamoured Sudabe, however, was not to be disappointed without further effort, and on a subsequent day she boldly went to the king, and praising the character and attainments of his son, proposed that he should be united in marriage to one of the damsels of royal lineage under her care. For the pretended purpose, therefore, of making his choice, she requested he might be sent to the harem, to see all the ladies and fix on one the most suited to his taste. The king approved of the proposal, and intimated it to Siavash, but Siavash was modest, timid, and bashful, and mentally suspected in this overture some artifice of Sudabe. He accordingly hesitated, but the king overcame his scruples, and the youth at length repaired to the Shabastan, as the retired apartments of the women are called, with fear and trembling. When he entered within the precincts of the sacred place, he was surprised by the richness and magnificence of everything that struck his sight. He was delighted with the company of beautiful women, and he observed Sudabe sitting on a splendid throne in an interior chamber, like heaven in beauty and loveliness, with a coronet on her head, and her hair floating around her in musky ringlets. Seeing him, she descended gracefully, and clasping him in her arms, kissed his eyes and face with such ardour and enthusiasm that he thought proper to retire from her endearments and mix among the other damsels, who placed him on a golden chair and kept him in agreeable conversation for some time. After this pleasing interview he returned to the king, and gave him a very favourable account of his reception, and the heavenly splendour of the retirement, worthy of Jamshid, Feridun, or Hushang, which gladdened his father's heart. Kavus repeated to him his wish that he would at once choose one of the lights of the harem for his wife, as the astrologers had prophesied on his marriage the birth of a prince. But Siavash endeavoured to excuse himself from going again to Sudabe's apartments. The king smiled at his weakness, and assured him that Sudabe was alone anxious for his happiness, upon which the youth found himself again in her power. She was surrounded by the damsels as before, but, whilst his eyes were cast down, they shortly disappeared, leaving him and the enamoured Sudabe together. She soon approached him, and lovingly said, "Oh, why the secret keep from one, whose heart is fixed on thee alone? Say who thou art, from whom descended, some peri with a mortal blended. For every maid who sees that face, that cypress form replete with grace, becomes a victim to the wiles which nestle in those dimpled smiles, becomes thy own adoring slave, whom nothing but thy love can save." To this Siavash made no reply. The history of the adventure of Kavus at Hamavaran, and what the king and his warriors endured in consequence of the treachery of the father of Sudabe, flashed upon his mind. He therefore was full of apprehension, and breathed not a word in answer to her fondness. Sudabe, observing his silence and reluctance, threw away from herself the veil of modesty, and said, "Oh, be my own, for I am thine, and clasp me in thy arms." And then she sprang to the astonished boy, and eagerly kissed his deep crimsoned cheek, which filled his soul with strange confusion. "When the king is dead, oh, take me to thyself. See how I stand, body and soul, devoted unto thee." In his heart he said, "This can never be. This is a demon's work. Shall I be treacherous? What, to my own dear father? Never, never, I will not thus be tempted by the devil. Yet must I not be cold to this wild woman, for fear of further folly. Siavash then expressed his readiness to be united in marriage to her daughter, and to no other, and when this intelligence was conveyed to Kavus by Surabe herself, his Majesty was extremely pleased, and munificently opened his treasury on the happy occasion. But Surabe still kept in view her own design, and still labouring for its success, sedulously led her own incantations to prevent disappointment, at any rate to punish the uncomplying youth if she failed. On another day she sent for him, and exclaimed, "I cannot now dissemble. Since I saw thee, I seem to be as dead. My heart's all withered. 7 years have passed in unrequited love. 7 long, long years. Oh, be not still obdurate, but with the generous impulse of affection, oh, bless my anxious spirit, or, refusing, thy life will be in peril. Thou shalt die." "Never," replied the youth. "Oh, never, never. Oh, ask me not, for this can never be." Siavash then rose to depart precipitately, but Surabe, observing him, endeavoured to cling round him and arrest his flight. The endeavour, however, was fruitless, and finding at late her situation desperate, she determined to turn the adventure into her own favour by accusing Siavash of an atrocious outrage on her own person and virtue. She accordingly tore her dress, screamed aloud, and rushed out of her apartment to inform Kavus of the indignity she had suffered. Among her women the most clamorous lamentations arose, and echoed on every side. The king, on hearing that Siavash had preferred Surabe to her daughter, and that he had meditated so abominable an offence, thought that death alone could expiate his crime. He therefore summoned him to his presence, but satisfied that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to ascertain the truth of the case from either party concerned, he had recourse to a test which he thought would be infallible and conclusive. He first smelt the hands of Siavash, and then his garments, which had the scent of rose-water, and then he took the garments of Surabe, which, on the contrary, had a strong flavour of wine and musk. Upon this discovery, the king resolved on the death of Surabe, being convinced of the falsehood of the accusation she had made against his son. But when his indignation subsided, he was induced on various accounts to forego that resolution. Yet he said to her, "I am sure that Siavash is innocent, but let that remain concealed." Surabe, however, persisted in asserting his guilt, and continually urged him to punish the reputed offender, but without being attended to. At length he resolved to ascertain the innocence of Siavash by the ordeal of fire, and the fearless youth prepared to undergo the terrible trial to which he was sentenced, telling his father to be under no alarm. "The truth, and its reward I claim, will bear me safe through fiercest flame." A tremendous fire was accordingly lighted on the adjacent plain, which blazed to an immense distance. The youth was attired in his golden helmet and a white robe, and mounted on a black horse. He put up a prayer to the Almighty for protection, and then rushed amidst the conflagration, as collectedly as if the act had been entirely free from peril. When Surabe heard the confused exclamations that were uttered at that moment, she hurried upon the terrace of the palace, and witnessed the appalling sight, and in the fondness of her heart wished even that she could share his fate, the fate of him of whom she was so deeply enamoured. The king himself fell from his throne in horror on seeing him surrounded and enveloped in the flames, from which there seemed no chance of extrication. But the gallant youth soon rose up, like the moon from the bursting element, and went through the ordeal unharmed and untouched by the fire. Kavus, on coming to his senses, rejoiced exceedingly on the happy occasion, and his severest anger was directed against Sudobe, whom he now determined to put to death, not only for her own guilt, but for exposing his son to such imminent danger. The noble youth, however, interceded for her. Sudobe, notwithstanding, still continued to practice her charms and incantations in secret, to the end that Siavash might be put out of the way, and in this pursuit she was indeed indefatigable. Suddenly, intelligence was received that Afrasiab had assembled another army for the purpose of making an eruption into Iran, and Kavus, seeing that a Tartar could neither be bound by promise nor oath, resolved that he would on this occasion take the field himself, penetrate as far as Balkh, and, seizing the country, make an example of the inhabitants. But Siavash, perceiving in this prospect of affairs an opportunity of becoming free from the machinations and witchery of Sudobe, earnestly requested to be employed, adding that, with the advice and bravery of Rostam, he would be sure of success. The king referred the matter to Rostam, who candidly declared that there was no necessity whatever for his majesty proceeding personally to the war, and upon this assurance he threw open his treasury, and supplied all the resources of the empire to equip the troops appointed to accompany them. After 1 month, the army marched toward Balkh, the point of attack. On the other side, Garsivaz, the ruler of Balgar, joined the Tartar legions at Balkh, commanded by Barahman, who both sallied forth to oppose the Persian host, and after a conflict of 3 days were defeated and obliged to abandon the fort. When the accounts of this calamity reached Afrasiab, he was seized with the utmost terror, which was increased by a dreadful dream. He thought he was in a forest abounding with serpents, and that the air was darkened by the appearance of countless eagles. The ground was parched up with heat, and a whirlwind hurled down his tent and overthrew his banners. On every side flowed a river of blood, and the whole of his army had been defeated and butchered in his sight. He was afterwards taken prisoner, and ignominiously conducted to Kavus, in whose company he beheld a gallant youth, not more than 14 years of age, who, the moment he saw him, plunged a dagger in his loins, and with the scream of agony produced by the wound, he awoke. Garsivaz had in the meantime returned with the remnant of his force, and being informed of these particulars, endeavoured to console Afrasiab by assuring him that the true interpretation of dreams was the reverse of appearances. But Afrasiab was not to be consoled in this manner. He referred to his astrologers, who, however, hesitated, and were unwilling to afford an explanation of the mysterious vision. At length, one of them, upon the solicited promise that the king would not punish him for divulging the truth, discussed the nature of the warning implied in what had been witnessed.
And now I throw aside the veil, which hides the darkly shadowed tale. Led by a prince of prosperous star, the Persian legions speed to war, and in his horoscope we scan the lordly victor of Turan. If thou shouldst to the conflict rush, opposed to conquering Siavash, thy Turkish cohorts will be slain, and all thy saving efforts vain. For if he, in the threatened strife, should haply chance to lose his life, thy country's fate will be the same, stripped of its throne and diadem.
Afrasiab was satisfied with this interpretation, and felt the prudence of avoiding a war so pregnant with evil consequences to himself and his kingdom. He therefore deputed Garsivaz to the headquarters of Siavash, with splendid presents, consisting of horses richly caparisoned, armour, swords, and other costly articles, and a written dispatch, proposing a termination to hostilities. In the meantime, Siavash was anxious to pursue the enemy across the J-Hoon, but was dissuaded by his friends, When Siavash arrived on his embassy, he was received with distinction, and the object of his mission being understood, a secret council was held upon what answer should be given. It was then deemed proper to demand, first, 100 distinguished heroes as hostages, and secondly, the restoration of all the provinces which the Turanians had taken from Iran. Siavash sent immediately to Afrasiab to inform him of the conditions required, and without the least delay they were approved. 100 warriors were soon on their way, and Bukhara, and Samarkand, and Han, and the Punjab were faithfully delivered over to Siavash. Afrasiab himself retired toward Gangdesh, saying,
"I have had a terrible dream, and I will surrender whatever may be required from me, rather than go to war."
The negotiations being concluded, Siavash sent a letter to his father by the hands of Rostam. Rumour, however, had already told Kavus of Afrasiab's dream, and the terror he had been thrown into in consequence. The astrologers in his service having prognosticated from it the certain ruin of the Turanian king, the object of Rostam's mission was directly contrary to the wishes of Kavus. But Rostam contended that the policy was good, and the terms were good, and he thereby incurred his Majesty's displeasure. On this account, Kavus appointed Tus, the leader of the Persian army, and commanded him to march against Afrasiab, ordering Siavash at the same time to return, and bring with him his 100 hostages. At this command, Siavash was grievously offended, and consulted with his chieftains, Bahram, and Zinjan, and Shahvaran, on the fittest course to be pursued, saying, "I have pledged my word to the fulfillment of the terms, and what will the world say if I do not keep my faith?" The chiefs tried to quiet his mind, and recommended him to write again to Kavus, expressing his readiness to renew the war and return the 100 hostages. But Siavash was in a different humour, and thought as Tus had been actually appointed to the command of the Persian army, it would be most advisable for him to abandon his country and join Afrasiab. The chiefs, upon hearing this singular resolution, unanimously attempted to dissuade him from pursuing so wild a course as throwing himself into the power of his enemy. But he was deaf to their entreaties, and in the stubbornness of his spirit wrote to Afrasiab, informing him that Kavus had refused to ratify the treaty of peace, that he was compelled to return the hostages, and even himself to seek protection in Turan from the resentment of his father, the warrior Tus, having been already entrusted with the charge of the army. This unexpected intelligence excited considerable surprise in the mind of Afrasiab, but he had no hesitation in selecting the course to be followed. The ambassadors, Zinjan and Shahvaran, were soon furnished with a reply, which was to this effect: "I settled the terms of peace with thee, not with thy father. With him I have nothing to do. If thy choice be retirement and tranquillity, thou shalt have a peaceful and independent province allotted to thee. But if war be thy object, I will furnish thee with a large army. Thy father is old and infirm, and with the aid of Rostam, Persia will be an easy conquest." Having thus obtained the promised favour and support of Afrasiab, Siavash gave in charge to Bahram, the city of Balkh, the army and treasure, in order that they might be delivered over to Tus on his arrival, and taking with him 300 chosen horsemen, passed the J-Hoon, in progress to the court of Afrasiab. On taking this decisive step, he again wrote to Kavus, saying, "From my youth upward I have suffered wrong. At first Surabeh, false and treacherous, sought to destroy my happiness and fame, and thou hadst nearly sacrificed my life to glut her vengeance. The astrologers were all unheeded, who pronounced me innocent, and I was doomed to brave devouring fire to testify that I was free from guilt. But God was my deliverer. Victory now has marked my progress. Balkh and all its spoils are mine, and so reduced the enemy that I have gained 100 hostages to guarantee the peace which I have made,
And what my recompense? A father's anger, which takes me from my glory. Thus deprived of thy affection, whither can I fly? Be it to friend or foe, the will of fate must be my only guide, condemned by thee.
The reception of Siavash by Afrasiab was warm and flattering. From the gates of the city to the palace, gold and incense were scattered over his head in the customary manner, and exclamations of welcome uttered on every side. Thy presence gives joy to the land, which awaits thy command. It is thine, it is thine. All the chiefs of the state have assembled to meet thee. All the flowers of the land are in blossom to greet thee. The youth was placed on a golden throne next to Afrasiab, at a magnificent banquet prepared in honor of the stranger, and music and the songs of beautiful women enlivened the festive scene. They chanted the praises of Siavash, distinguished, as they said, among men for three things. First, for being of the line of Kay-Gobad. Secondly, for his faith and honor. And thirdly, for the wonderful beauty of his person, which had gained universal love and admiration. The favorable sentiments which characterized the first introduction of Siavash to Afrasiab continued to prevail, and indeed the king of Turan seemed to regard him with increased attachment and friendship, as the time passed away, and showed him all the respect and honor to which his royal birth would have entitled him in his own country. After the lapse of a year, Feranguis, one of Afrasiab's generals, said to him,
Young prince, thou art now high in the favour of the king, and at a great distance from Persia. And thy father is old. Would it not therefore be better for thee to marry, and take up thy residence among us for life?
The suggestion was a rational one, and Siavash readily expressed his acquiescence. Accordingly, the lovely Gulshar, who was also named Jarire, having been introduced to him, he was delighted with her person, and both consenting to a union, the marriage ceremony was immediately performed. And many a warm, delicious kiss told how he loved the wedded bliss. Some time after this union, Turan suggested another alliance, for the purpose of strengthening his political interest and power, and this was with Feranguis, the daughter of Afrasiab. But Siavash was so devoted to Gulshar that he first consulted with her on the subject, although the hospitality and affection of the king constituted such strong claims on his gratitude that refusal was impossible. Gulshar, however, was a heroine, and willingly sacrificed her own feelings for the good of Siavash, saying she would rather condescend to be the very handmaid of Feranguis than that the happiness and prosperity of her lord should be compromised. The second marriage accordingly took place, and Afrasiab was so pleased with the match that he bestowed on the bride and her husband the sovereignty of Khotan, together with countless treasure in gold and a great number of horses, camels, and elephants. In a short time they proceeded to the seat of the new government. Meanwhile, Kavus suffered the keenest distress and sorrow when he heard of the flight of Siavash into Turan, and Rostam felt such strong indignation at the conduct of the king that he abruptly quitted the court, without permission, and retired to Sistan. Kavus thus found himself in an embarrassed condition, and deemed it prudent to recall both Tus and the army from Balkh, and relinquish further hostile measures against Afrasiab. The first thing that Siavash undertook after his arrival at Khotan was to order the selection of a beautiful site for his residence, and Turan devoted his services to fulfill that object, exploring all the provinces, hills, and dales on every side. At last he discovered a beautiful spot, at the distance of about a month's journey, which combined all the qualities and advantages required by the anxious prince. It was situated on a mountain, and surrounded by scenery of exquisite richness and variety. The trees were fresh and green, birds warbled on every spray, transparent rivulets murmured through the meadows, The air was neither oppressively hot in summer nor cold in winter, so that the temperature and the attractive objects which presented themselves at every glance seemed to realize the imagined charms and fascinations of paradise. The inhabitants enjoyed perpetual health, and every breeze was laden with music and perfume. So lovely a place could not fail to yield pleasure to Siavash, who immediately set about building a palace there, and garden temples, in which he had pictures painted of the most remarkable persons of his time, and also the portraits of ancient kings. The walls were decorated with the likenesses of Keigawad, Keikavus, Pashang, Afrasiab, and Sam, and Zal, and Rostam, and other champions of Persia and Turan. When completed, it was a gorgeous retreat, and the sight of it sufficient to give youthful vigour to the withered faculties of age. And yet Siavash was not happy. Tears started into his eyes, and sorrow weighed upon his heart, whenever he thought upon his own estrangement from home. It happened that the lovely Gulshar, who had been left in the house of her father, was delivered of a son in due time, and he was named Forud. Afrasiab, on being informed of the proceedings of Siavash, and of the heart-expanding residence he had chosen, was highly gratified, and to show his affectionate regard, dispatched to him with the intelligence of the birth of a son, presents of great value and variety, Garsivas, the brother of Afrasiab, and who had from the first looked upon Siavash with a jealous and malignant eye, being afraid of his interfering with his own prospects in Turan, was the person sent on this occasion. But he hid his secret doubts under the veil of outward praise and approbation. Siavash was pleased with the intelligence and the presents, but failed to pay the customary respect to Garsivas on his arrival, and in consequence, the lurking indignation and hatred formerly felt by the latter were considerably augmented. The attention of Siavash respecting his army and the concerns of the state was unremitting, and noted by the visitor with a jealous and scrutinizing eye, so that Garsivas, on his return to the court of Afrasiab, artfully talked much of the pomp and splendour of the prince, and added, "Siavash is far from being the amiable character thou hast supposed. He is artful and ambitious, and he has collected an immense army. He is in fact dissatisfied. As a proof of his haughtiness, he paid me but little attention, and doubtless very heavy calamity will soon befall Turan, should he break out, as I apprehend he will, into open rebellion. For he is proud, and thou hast yet to learn the temper of thy daughter Feranguis, now bound to him in duty and affection. Their purpose is the same, to overthrow the kingdom of Turan and thy dominion, to merge the glory of this happy realm into the Persian Empire." But plausible and persuasive as were the observations and positive declarations of Garsivas, Afrasiab would not believe the imputed ingratitude and hostility of Siavash. "He has sought my protection," said he. "He has thrown himself upon my generosity, and I cannot think him treacherous. But if he has meditated anything unmerited by me, and unworthy of himself, it will be better to send him back to Keikavus, his father." The artful Garsivas, however, was not to be diverted from his object. He said that Siavash had become personally acquainted with Turan, its position, its weakness, its strength and resources, and aided by Rostam, would soon be able to overrun the country if he was suffered to return, and therefore he recommended Afrasiab to bring him from Khotan by some artifice, and secure him. In conformity with this suggestion, Garsivas was again deputed to the young prince, and a letter of a friendly nature written for the purpose of blinding him to the real intentions of his father-in-law. The letter was no sooner read than Siavash expressed his desire to comply with the request contained in it, saying that Afrasiab had been a father to him, and that he would lose no time in fulfilling in all respects the wishes he had received. This compliance and promptitude, however, was not in harmony with the sinister views of Garcivaz, for he foresaw that the very fact of answering the call immediately would show that some misrepresentation had been practiced, and consequently it was his business now to promote procrastination, and an appearance of evasive delay. He therefore said to him privately that it would be advisable for him to wait a little, and not manifest such implicit obedience to the will of Afrasiab. But Siavash replied that both his duty and affection urged him to a ready compliance. Then Garcivaz pressed him more warmly, and represented how inconsistent, how unworthy of his illustrious lineage it would be to betray so meek a spirit, especially as he had a considerable army at his command, and could vindicate his dignity and his rights. And he addressed to him these specious arguments so incessantly and with such earnestness that the deluded prince was at last induced to put off his departure, on account of his wife Feranguis pretending that she was ill, and saying that the moment she was better, he would return to Turan. This was quite enough for treachery to work upon, and as soon as the dispatch was sealed, Garcivaz conveyed it with the utmost expedition to Afrasiab. Appearances, at least, were thus made strong against Siavash, and the tyrant of Turan, now easily convinced of his falsehood, and feeling in consequence his former enmity renewed, forthwith assembled an army to punish his refractory son-in-law. Garcivaz was appointed the leader of that army, which was put in motion without delay against the unoffending youth. The news of Afrasiab's warlike preparations satisfied the mind of Siavash that Garcivaz had given him good advice, and that he had been a faithful monitor, for immediate compliance, he now concluded, would have been his utter ruin. When he communicated this unwelcome intelligence to Feranguis, she was thrown into the greatest alarm and agitation, but ever fruitful in expedients, suggested the course that it seemed necessary he should instantly adopt, which was to fly by a circuitous route back to Iran. To this he expressed no dissent, provided she would accompany him. But she said it was impossible to do so on account of the condition she was in. "Leave me," she added, "and save thy own life." He therefore called together his 300 Iranians, and requesting Feranguis, if she happened to be delivered of a son, to call him Khosrow, set off on his journey. I go, surrounded by my enemies, the hand of merciless Afrasiab lifted against me. It was not the fortune of Siavash, however, to escape so easily as had been anticipated by Feranguis. Garcivaz was soon at his heels, and in the battle that ensued all the Iranians were killed, and also the horse upon which the unfortunate prince rode, so that on foot he could make but little progress. In the meantime, Afrasiab came up, and surrounding him, wanted to shoot him with an arrow, but he was restrained from the violent act by the intercession of his people, who recommended his being taken alive and only kept in prison. Accordingly, he was again attacked and secured, but still Afrasiab wished to put him to death. But Pilsam, one of his warriors, and the brother of Piran, induced him to relinquish that diabolical intention, and to convey him back to his own palace. Siavash was then ignominiously fettered and conducted to the royal residence, which he had himself erected and ornamented with such richness and magnificence. The sight of the city and its splendid buildings filled everyone with wonder and admiration. Upon the arrival of Afrasiab, Feranguis hastened to him in a state of the deepest distress, and implored his clemency and compassion in favour of Siavash. "O father, he is not to blame. Still pure and spotless is his name, faithful and generous still to me, and never, never false to thee. This hate to Garcivaz he owes, the worst, the bitterest of his foes. Did he not thy protection seek, and wilt thou overpower the weak? Spill royal blood thou shouldst bless,
in cruel sport and wantonness, and earn the curses of mankind, living in this precarious state, and dead the torments of the mind, which hell inflicts upon the great, who revel in a murderous curse, and rule by cruelty and force. It scarce becomes me now to tell what the accursed Zahak befell, or what the punishment which hurled Salm and Tur from out the world. And is not Kavus living now, with rightful vengeance on his brow, and Rostam, who alone can make the kingdom to its centre quake, Gudars, Zurara, and Feribors, and Tus, and Gorgin, and Faramars, and others too of fearless might, to challenge thee to mortal fight. Oh, from this peril turn away, cease not in gloom so bright a day. Some heed to thy poor daughter give, and let thy guiltless captive live. The effect of this appeal, solemnly and urgently delivered, was only transitory. Afrasiab felt a little compunction at the moment, but soon resumed his ferocious spirit, and to ensure, without interruption, the accomplishment of his purpose, confined Feranguis in one of the remotest parts of the palace. And thus to Garsivaz the unfeeling spoke.
Off with his head, down with the enemy, but take especial notice that his blood stains not the earth, lest it should cry aloud for vengeance on us. Take good care of that.
Garsivaz, who was but too ready an instrument, immediately directed Garvi Zareh, a kinsman of Afrasiab, who had been also one of the most zealous in promoting the ruin of the Persian prince to inflict the deadly blow, and Siavash, whilst under the grasp of the executioner, had but time to put up a prayer to heaven, in which he hoped that a son might be born to him to vindicate his good name, and be revenged on his murderer. The executioner then seized him by the hair, and throwing him on the ground, severed the head from the body. A golden vessel was ready to receive the blood, as commanded by Afrasiab, but a few drops happened to be spilt on the soil, and upon that spot a tree grew up, which was afterwards called Siavash, and believed to possess many wonderful virtues. The blood was carefully conveyed to Afrasiab, the head fixed on the point of a javelin, and the body was buried with respect and affection by his friend Pilsam, who had witnessed the melancholy catastrophe. It is also related that a tremendous tempest occurred at the time this amiable prince was murdered, and that a total darkness covered the face of the earth, so that the people could not distinguish each other's faces. Then was the name of Afrasiab truly execrated and abhorred for the cruel act he had committed, and all the inhabitants of Khotan long cherished the memory of Siavash. Feranguis was frantic with grief when she was told of the sad fate of her husband, and all her household uttered the loudest lamentations. Pilsam gave the intelligence to Turan, and the proverb was then remembered, "It is better to be in hell than under the rule of Afrasiab." When the deep sorrow of Feranguis reached the ears of her father, he determined on a summary procedure, and ordered Garsivaz to have her privately made away with, so that there might be no issue of her marriage with Siavash. Turan, with horror, heard this stern command, and hastened to the king, and thus addressed him.
What? Wouldst thou hurl thy vengeance on a woman, that woman too thy daughter? Is it wise or natural thus to sport with human life? Already hast thou taken from her arms her unoffending husband. That was cruel. But thus to shed an innocent woman's blood, and kill her unborn infant, that would be too dreadful to imagine. Is she not thy own fair daughter, given in happier time to him who won thy favour and affection? Think but of that, and from thy heart root out this demon wish, which leads thee to a crime, mocking concealment. Vain were the endeavour to keep the murder secret, and when known, the world's opprobrium would pursue thy name. And after death, what would thy portion be? No more of this. Honour me with the charge, and I will keep her with a father's care in my own mansion."
Then Afrasiab readily answered, "Take her to thy home, but when the child is born, let it be brought promptly to me. My will must be obeyed." Piran rejoiced at his success, and assenting to the command of Afrasiab, took Feranguis with him to Khotan, where in due time a child was born, and being a son, was named Khosrow. As soon as he was born, Piran took measures to prevent his being carried off to Afrasiab, and committed him to the care of some peasants on the mountain Gala. On the same night, Afrasiab had a dream, in which he received intimation of the birth of Khosrow, and upon this intimation he sent for Piran to know why his commands had not been complied with. Piran replied that he had cast away the child in the wilderness.
"And why was he not sent to me?"
inquired the despot.
"Because," said Piran, "I considered thy own future happiness. Thou hast unjustly killed the father, and God forbid that thou shouldst also kill the son."
Afrasiab was abashed, and it is said that ever after the atrocious murder of Siavash, he had been tormented with the most terrible and harrowing dreams. Gausivaz now became hateful to his sight, and he began at last deeply to repent of his violence and inhumanity. Khosrow grew up under the fostering protection of the peasants, and showed early marks of surprising talent and activity. He excelled in manly exercises, and hunting ferocious animals was his peculiar delight. Instructors had been provided to initiate him in all the arts and pursuits cultivated by the warriors of those days, and even in his 12th year accounts were forwarded to Piran of several wonderful feats which he had performed. Then smiled the good old man, and joyful said, "'Tis ever thus. The youth of royal blood will not disgrace his lineage, but betray by his superior mien and gallant deeds from whence he sprung. 'Tis by the luscious fruit we know the tree, and glory in its ripeness." Piran could not resist paying a visit to the youth in his mountainous retreat, and, happy to find him, beyond all expectation, distinguished for the elegance of his external appearance and the superior qualities of his mind, related to him the circumstances under which he had been exposed, and the rank and misfortunes of his father. An artifice then occurred to him which promised to be of ultimate advantage. He afterwards told Afrasiab that the offspring of Feranguis, thrown by him into the wilderness to perish, had been found by a peasant and brought up, but that he understood the boy was little better than an idiot. Afrasiab, upon this information, desired that he might be sent for, and in the meantime Piran took especial care to instruct Khosrow how he should act, which was to seem in all respects insane, and he accordingly appeared before the king in the dress of a prince with a golden crown on his head, and the royal girdle round his loins. Khosrow proceeded on horseback to the court of Afrasiab, and having performed the usual salutations, was suitably received, though with strong feelings of shame and remorse on the part of the tyrant. Afrasiab put several questions to him, which were answered in a wild and incoherent manner, entirely at variance with the subject proposed. The king could not help smiling, and supposing him to be totally deranged, allowed him to be sent with presents to his mother, for no harm, he thought, could possibly be apprehended from one so forlorn in mind. Piran triumphed in the success of his scheme, and lost no time in taking Khosrow to his mother. All the people of Khotan poured blessings on the head of the youth, and imprecations on the merciless spirit of Afrasiab. The city, built by Siavash, had been razed to the ground by the exterminating fury of his enemies, and wild animals and reptiles occupied the place on which it stood. The mother and son visited the spot where Siavash was barbarously killed, and the tree, which grew up from the soil enriched by his blood, was found verdant and flourishing, and continued to possess in perfection its marvellous virtues. The tale of Siavash is told, and now the pages bright unfold. Rostam's revenge, Sudabeh's fate, Afrasiab's degraded state, and that terrific curse and ban which fell at last upon Turan. When Kavus heard the fate of his son, and all its horrible details were pictured to his mind, he was thrown into the deepest affliction. His warriors, Tus and Gudars and Bahram and Faribors and Farhad, felt with equal keenness the loss of the amiable prince, and Rostam, as soon as the dreadful intelligence reached Sistan, set off with his troops to the court of the king, still full of indignation at the conduct of Kavus, and oppressed with sorrow respecting the calamity which had occurred. On his arrival, he thus addressed the weeping and disconsolate father of Siavash, himself at the same time drowned in tears.
How has thy temper turned to naught, the seed which might have grown and cast a glorious shadow? How it is scattered to the barren winds! Thy love for false Sudabeh was the case of all this misery. She, the sorceress over whom thou hast so oft in rapture hung, enchanted by her charms, she was the cause of this destruction. Thou art woman's slave, woman the bane of man's felicity. Whoever trusted woman, death were better than being under woman's influence. She places man upon the foamy ridge of the tempestuous wave, which rolls to ruin. Whoever trusted woman? Woman! Woman!
Kavus looked down with melancholy mien, and, half consenting, thus to Rostam said,
Sudabeh's blandishments absorb my soul, and she has brought this wretchedness upon me.
Rostam rejoined,
The world must be revenged upon this false Sudabeh. She must die.
Kavus was silent, but his tears flowed fast, and shame withheld resistance. Rostam rushed without a pause towards the Shabastan. Impatient, nothing could obstruct his speed to slay Sudabeh. Her he quickly found, and rapidly his sanguinary sword performed its office. Thus the sorceress died. Such was the punishment her crimes received. Having thus accomplished the first part of his vengeance, he proceeded with the Persian army against Afrasiab, and all the Iranian warriors followed his example. When he had penetrated as far as Turan, the enemy sent forward 30,000 men to oppose his progress, and in the conflict which ensued, Feranguis took Sarkar, the son of Afrasiab, prisoner. Rostam delivered him over to Tus to be put to death precisely in the same manner as Siavash, but the captive represented himself as the particular friend of Siavash, and begged to be pardoned on that account. Rostam, however, had sworn that he would take his revenge without pity or remorse, and accordingly death was inflicted upon the unhappy prisoner, whose blood was received in a dish and sent to Kavus, and the severed head suspended over the gates of the king's palace. Afrasiab, hearing of this catastrophe, which sealed the fate of his favourite son, immediately collected together the whole of the Turanian army, and hastened himself to resist the conquering career of the enemy. As on they moved, with loud and dissonant clang, his numerous troops shut out the prospect round. No sun was visible by day, no moon nor stars by night. The tramp of men and steeds, and rattling drums and shouts, were only heard, and the bright gleams of armour only seen. Ere long the two armies met, when Pilsam, the brother of Piran, was ambitious of opposing his single arm against Rostam, upon which Afrasiab said,
"Subdue Rostam, and thy reward shall be my daughter, and half my kingdom."
Turan, however, observed that he was too young to be a fit match for the experience and valour of the Persian champion, and would have dissuaded him from the unequal contest. But the choice was his own, and he was consequently permitted by Afrasiab to put his bravery to the test. Pilsam accordingly went forth and summoned Rostam to the fight, but Give, hearing the call, accepted the challenge himself, and had nearly been thrown from his horse by the superior activity of his opponent. Feranguis luckily saw him at the perilous moment, and darting forward, with one stroke of his sword, shattered Pilsam's javelin to pieces. And then a new strife began. Pilsam and Feranguis fought together with desperation, till both were almost exhausted, and Rostam himself was surprised to see the display of so much valour. Perceiving the wearied state of the two warriors, he pushed forward Raksh, and called aloud to Pilsam, "Am I not the person challenged?" And immediately the Turanian chief proceeded to encounter him, striking with all his might at the head of the champion. But though the sword was broken by the blow, not a hair of his head was disordered. Then Rostam, urging on his gallant steed, fixed his long javelin in the girdle band of his ambitious foe, and quick unhorsed him, then dragged him on towards Afrasiab, and, scoffing, cast him at the despot's feet. "Here comes the glorious conqueror," he said. "Now give to him thy daughter and thy treasure, thy kingdom and thy soldiers. Has he not done honour to thy country? Is he not a jewel in thy crown of sovereignty? What arrogance inspired the fruitless hope? Think of thy treachery to Siavash, thy savage cruelty, and never look for aught but deadly hatred from mankind. And in the field of fight, defeat and ruin." Thus scornfully he spoke, and not a man, though in the presence of Afrasiab, had soul to meet him. Fear overcame them all, monarch and warriors, for a time. At length shame was awakened, and the king appeared in arms against the champion. Fiercely they hurled their sharp javelins. Rostam's struck the head of his opponent's horse, which floundering fell, and overturned his rider. Anxious then, the champion sprang to seize the royal prize, but Human rushed between and saved his master, who vaulted on another horse and fled. Having thus rescued Afrasiab, the wary chief exercised all his cunning and adroitness to escape himself, and at last succeeded. Rostam pursued him and the Turanian troops, who had followed the example of the king. But though thousands were slain in the chase which continued for many farsangs, no further advantage was obtained on that day. Next morning, however, Rostam resumed his pursuit, and the enemy, hearing of his approach, retreated into Chinese Tartary to secure, among other advantages, the person of Khosrow, leaving the kingdom of Turan at the mercy of the invader, who mounted the throne and ruled there, it is said, about 7 years with memorable severity, prescribing and putting to death every person who mentioned the name of Afrasiab. In the meantime, he made splendid presents to Tus and Gudaus, suitable to their rank and services, and Zavara, in revenge for the monstrous outrage committed upon Siavash, burnt and destroyed everything that came in his way, his wrath being exasperated by the sight of the places in which the young prince had resided, and recreated himself with hunting and other sports of the field. The whole realm, in fact, was delivered over to plunder and devastation, and every individual of the army was enriched by the appropriation of public and private wealth. The companions of Rostam, however, grew weary of residing in Turan, and they strongly represented to him the neglect which Kavus had suffered for so many years, recommending his return to Persia as being more honourable than the exile they endured in an ungenial climate. Rostam's abandonment of the kingdom was at length carried into effect, and he and his warriors did not fail to take away with them all the immense property that remained in jewels and gold, part of which was conveyed by the championed Zabol and Sistan, and a goodly proportion to the king of kings in Persia. When to Afrasiab was known the plunder of his realm and throne, that the destroyer's reckless hand with fire and sword had scathed the land, sorrow and anguish filled his soul, and passion raged beyond control. And thus he to his warriors said, "At such a time is valor dead? The man who hears the mournful tale, and is not by his country's bale urged on to vengeance, cannot be of woman born. Accursed is he. The time will come when I shall reap the harvest of resentment deep, and till arrives that fated hour, farewell to joy in hall or bower." Rostam, in taking revenge for the murder of Siavash, had not been unmindful of Khosrow, and had actually sent to the remote parts of Tartary in quest of him. It is said that Gudars beheld in a dream the young prince, who pointed out to him his actual residence, and intimated that of all the warriors of Kavus, Giv was the only one destined to restore him to the world and his birthright. The old man immediately requested his son Giv to go to the place where the stranger would be found. Giv readily complied, and in his progress provided himself at every stage successively with a guide, whom he afterwards slew to prevent discovery, and in this manner he proceeded till he reached the boundary of Chin, enjoying no comfort by day or sleep by night. His only food was the flesh of the wild ass, and his only covering the skin of the same animal. He went on traversing mountain and forest, enduring every privation, and often did he hesitate, often did he think of returning, but honour urged him forward in spite of the trouble and impediments with which he was continually assailed. Arriving in a desert one day, he happened to meet with several persons, who, upon being interrogated, said that they were sent by Feranguis in search of Kavus. Giv kept his own secret, saying that he was amusing himself with hunting the wild ass, but took care to ascertain from them the direction in which they were going. During the night the parties separated, and in the morning Giv proceeded rapidly on his route, and after some time discovered a youth sitting by the side of a fountain, with a cup in his hand, whom he supposed to be Khosrow. The youth also spontaneously thought, "This must be Giv," and when the traveller approached him and said, "I am sure thou art the son of Siavash," the youth observed, "I am equally sure that thou art Giv, the son of Gudars." At this, Giv was amazed, and falling to his feet, asked how and from what circumstance he recognized him. The youth replied that he knew all the warriors of Kavus, Rostam and Kashvad and Tus and Gudars and the rest, from their portraits in his father's gallery, they being deeply impressed on his mind. He then asked in what way Giv had discovered him to be Khosrow, and Giv answered, "Because I perceived something kingly in thy countenance. But let me again examine thee." The youth at this request removed his garments, and Giv beheld that mark on his body which was the heritage of the race of Gobard. Upon this discovery he rejoiced, and congratulating himself and the young prince on the success of his mission, related to him the purpose for which he had come. Khosrow was soon mounted on horseback, and Giv accompanied him respectfully on foot. They, in the first instance, pursued their way towards the abode of Feranguis, his mother. The persons sent by Feranguis did not arrive at the place where Khosrow had been kept till long after Giv and the prince departed, and then they were told that a Persian horseman had come and carried off the youth, upon which they immediately returned, and communicated to Turan what had occurred. Feranguis, in recovering her son, mentioned to Give, with the fondness of a mother, the absolute necessity of going on without delay, and pointed out to him the meadow in which some of Afrasiab's horses were to be met with, particularly one called Bethzard, which once belonged to Siavash, and which her father had kept in good condition for his own riding. Give, therefore, went to the meadow, and throwing his command, secured Bethzard and another horse, and all three being thus accommodated, hastily proceeded on their journey towards Iran. Tidings of the escape of Khosrow having reached Afrasiab, he dispatched Kolbad with 300 horsemen after him, and so rapid were his movements that he overtook the fugitives in the vicinity of Bulgaria. Khosrow and his mother were asleep, but Give, being awake, and seeing an armed force evidently in pursuit of his party, boldly put on his armour, mounted Bethzard, and before the enemy came up, advanced to the charge. He attacked the horsemen furiously with sword and mace, for he had heard the prophecy, which declared that Khosrow was destined to be the king of kings, and therefore he braved the direst peril with confidence, and the certainty of success. It was this feeling which enabled him to perform such a prodigy of valour in putting Kolbad and his 300 horsemen to the rout. They all fled, defeated, and dispersed precipitately before him. After this surprising victory, he returned to the halting place, and told Khosrow what he had done. The prince was disappointed at not having been awakened to participate in the exploit, but Give said, "I did not wish to disturb thy sweet slumbers unnecessarily. It was thy good fortune and prosperous star, however, which made me triumph over the enemy." The three travellers then resuming their journey. Through dreary track and pathless waste, and wood and wild, their way they traced. The return of the defeated Kolbad excited the greatest indignation in the breast of Turan. "What? 300 soldiers to fly from the valour of one man? Had Give possessed even the activity and might of Rostam and Sam, such a shameful discomfiture could scarcely have happened." Saying this, he ordered the whole force under his command to be got ready, and set off himself to overtake and intercept the fugitives, who, fatigued with the toilsome march, were only able to proceed one stage in the day. Turan, therefore, who had travelled at the rate of 100 leagues a day, overtook them before they had passed through Bulgaria. Feranguis, who saw the enemy's banner floating in the air, knew that it belonged to Turan, and instantly awoke the two young men from sleep. Upon this occasion, Khosrow insisted on acting his part, instead of being left ignominiously idle. But Give was still resolute, and determined to preserve him from all risk at the peril of his own life. "Thou art destined to be the king of the world. Thou art yet young and a novice, and hast never known the toils of war. Heaven forbid that any misfortune should befall thee. Indeed, whilst I live, I will never suffer thee to go into battle." Khosrow then proposed to give him assistance, but Give said he wanted no assistance, not even from Rostam. "For," he added, "in art and strength we are equal, having frequently tried our skill together." Rostam had given his daughter in marriage to Give, he himself being married to Giv's sister. "Be of good cheer," resumed he. "Get upon some high place, and witness the battle between us. Fortune will still from heaven descend. The god of victory is my friend." As soon as he took the field, Turan thus addressed him. "Thou hast once, singly, defeated 300 of my soldiers. Thou shalt now see what punishment awaits thee at my hands. For should a warrior be a rock of steel, 1,000 ants, gathered on every side, in time will make him but a heap of dust." In reply, Give said to Turan,
I am the man who bound thy 2 women, and sent them from China to Persia. Rostam and I are the same in battle. Thou knowest, when he encountered 1,000 horsemen, what was the result, and what he accomplished. Thou wilt find me the same. Is not a lion enough to overthrow 1,000 kids? If but a man survive of thy proud host, brand me with coward. Say I'm not a warrior. Already I have triumphed over Kolbad, and now I'll take thee prisoner, yea, alive, and send thee to Kavus. There thou wilt be slain to avenge the death of Siavash. Turan shall perish, and Afrasiab, and every earthly hope extinguished quite. Hearing this awful threat, Turan turned pale, and shook with terror, trembling like a reed, and saying, Go, I will not fight with thee. But Give asked fiercely, Why? And on he rushed against the foe who fled, but 'twas in vain. The command round the old man's neck was thrown, and he was taken captive. Then his troops showered their sharp arrows on triumphant Give to free their master, who was quickly brought before Kay Khosrow, and the command placed within his royal hands. This service done, Give sped against the Tartars, and full soon defeated and dispersed them. On his return, Give expressed his astonishment that Turan was still alive, when Feranguis interposed, and weeping, said how much she had been indebted to his interposition, and the most active humanity on various occasions, and particularly in saving herself and Kay Khosrow from the wrath of Afrasiab after the death of Siavash. If, said she, after so much generosity he has committed one fault, let it be forgiven. Let not the man of many virtues die for being guilty of one trifling error. Let not the friend who nobly saved my life, and more, the dearer life of Kay Khosrow, suffer from us. Oh, he must never feel the sharp pang of foul ingratitude from a true prince of the Kianian race. But Give paused and said, I have sworn to crimson the earth with his blood, and I must not pass from my oath. Khosrow then suggested to him to pierce the lobes of Turan's ears and drop the blood on the ground to stain it, in order that he might not depart from this world, and this humane fraud was accordingly committed. Khosrow further interceded, and instead of being sent a captive to Kavus, the good old man was set at liberty. When the particulars of this event were described to Afrasiab by Turan Vizar, he was exceedingly sorrowful, and lamented deeply that Kay Khosrow had so successfully effected his escape. But he had recourse to a further expedient, and sent instructions to all the ferrymen of the J-Hoon, with a minute description of the 3 travellers, to prevent their passing that river, announcing at the same time that he himself was in pursuit of them. Not a moment was lost in preparing his army for the march, and he moved forward with the utmost expedition, night and day. At the period when Give arrived on the banks of the J-Hoon, the stream was very rapid and formidable, and he requested the ferrymen to produce their certificates to show themselves equal to their duty. They pretended that their certificates were lost, but demanded for their fare the black horse upon which Give rode. Give replied that he could not part with his favourite horse, and they rejoined, Then give us the damsel who accompanies you. Give answered and said, This is not a damsel, but the mother of that youth. Then, observed they, give us the youth's crown. But Give told them that he could not comply with their demand, yet he was ready to reward them with money to any extent. The pertinacious ferrymen, who were not anxious for money, then demanded his armour, and this was also refused, and such was their independence or their effrontery, that they replied, If not one of these 4 things you are disposed to grant, cross the river as best you may.
Give whispered to Kay Khosrow and told him that there was no time for delay. "When Kaveh, the blacksmith," said he, "rescued thy great ancestor Feridun, he passed the stream in his armor without impediment, and why should we, in a cause of equal glory, hesitate for a moment?" Under the inspiring influence of an auspicious omen, and confiding in the protection of the Almighty, Kay Khosrow at once impelled his foaming horse into the river. His mother, Feranguis, followed with equal intrepidity, and then Give, and notwithstanding the perilous passage, they all successfully overcame the boiling surge, and landed in safety, to the utter amazement of the ferryman, who of course had expected that they would be drowned. It so happened that at the moment they touched the shore, Afrasiab with his army arrived, and had the mortification to see the fugitives on the other bank, beyond his reach. His wonder was equal to his disappointment.
What spirits must they have to brave the terrors of that boiling wave, with steed and harness riding over the billows to the further shore?
It was a cheering sight, they say, to see how well they kept their way, how Feranguis impelled her horse across that awful torrent's course, guiding him with heroic hand to reach unhurt the friendly strand. Afrasiab continued for some time, mute with astonishment and vexation, and when he recovered, ordered the ferrymen to get ready their boats to pass him over the river, but Human dissuaded him from that measure, saying that they could only convey a few troops, and they would doubtless be received by a large force of the enemy on the other side. At these words, Afrasiab seemed to devour his own blood with grief and indignation, and immediately retracing his steps, returned to Turan. As soon as Give entered within the boundary of the Persian Empire, he poured out thanksgivings to God for his protection, and sent intelligence to Kavus of the safe arrival of the party in his dominions. The king rejoiced exceedingly, and appointed an honorary deputation under the direction of Gudars to meet the young prince on the road. On first seeing him, the king moved forward to receive him, and, weeping affectionately, kissed his eyes and face, and had a throne prepared for him exactly like his own, upon which he seated him, and calling the nobles and warriors of the land together, commanded them to obey him. All readily promised their allegiance, excepting Tus, who left the court in disgust, and repairing forthwith to the house of Fariborz, one of the sons of Kavus, told him that he would only pay homage and obedience to him, and not to the infant whom Give had just brought out of a desert. Next day, the great men and leaders were again assembled to declare publicly by an official act their fealty to Kay Khosrow, and Tus was also invited to the banquet, which was held on the occasion, but he refused to go. Give was deputed to repeat the invitation, and he then said, "I shall pay homage to Fariborz as the heir to the throne, and to no other. For is he not the son of Kay Kavus, and worthy of the regal crown and throne? I want not any of the race of Pashang, none of the proud Turanian dynasty. Fruitless has been thy peril, Give, to bring a silly child among us, to defraud the rightful prince of his inheritance." Give, in reply, vindicated the character and attainments of Khosrow, but Tus was not to be appeased. He therefore returned to his father and communicated to him what had occurred. Gudars was roused to great wrath by this resistance to the will of the king, and at once took 12,000 men and his 78 kinsmen, together with Give, and proceeded to support his cause by force of arms. Tus, apprised of his intentions, prepared to meet him, but was reluctant to commit himself by engaging in a civil war, and said internally, "If I unsheath the sword of strife, numbers on either side will fall. I would not sacrifice the life of one who owns my sovereign's thrall.
My country would abhor the deed, and may I never see the hour when Persia's sons are doomed to bleed, but when opposed to foreign power. The cause must be both good and true, and if their blood in war must flow, will it not seem of brighter hue, when shed to crush the Tartar foe?
Possessing these sentiments, Tus sent an envoy to Gudars, suggesting the suspension of any hostile proceedings until information on the subject had first been communicated to the king. Kavus was extremely displeased with Gudars for his precipitancy and folly, and directed both him and Tus to repair immediately to court. Tus there said frankly, I now owe honor and allegiance to King Kavus, but should he happen to lay aside the throne and the diadem, my obedience and loyalty will be due to Feranguis, his heir, and not to a stranger. To this, Gudars replied, Siavash was the eldest son of the king, and unjustly murdered, and therefore it becomes his majesty to appease and rejoice the soul of the deceased by putting Khosrow in his place. Khosrow, like Feridun, is worthy of empire. All the nobles of the land are of this opinion, excepting thyself, which must arise from ignorance and vanity. From no Tsar certainly thou art descended, not from a stranger, not from foreign loins. But though thy ancestor was wise and mighty, art thou of equal merit? No, not thou. Regarding Khosrow, thou hast neither shown reason nor sense, but most surprising folly. To this contemptuous speech, Tus thus replied, Ungenerous warrior, wherefore thus employ such scornful words to me? Who art thou, pray? Who but the low descendant of a blacksmith? No Khosrow claims thee for his son, no chief of noble blood, whilst I can truly boast kindred to princes of the highest worth, and merit not to be obscured by thee. To him then, Gudars, Hear me for this once, then shut thy ears forever. Need I blush to be the kinsman of the glorious Kaveh? It is my humour to be proud of him. Although he was a blacksmith, that same man who, when the world could still boast of valour, tore up the name-roll of the fiend Sahak, and gave the Persians freedom from the fangs of the devouring serpents. He it was who raised the banner and proclaimed aloud, Freedom for Persia. Need I blush for him? To him the empire owes its greatest blessing, the prosperous rule of virtuous Feridun. Tus wrathfully rejoined, Old man, thy arrow may pierce an anvil. Mine can pierce the heart of the Kaf mountain. If thy mace can break a rock asunder, mine can strike the sun. The anger of the two heroes beginning to exceed all proper bounds, Kavus commanded silence. When Gudars came forward and asked permission to say one word more, Call Khosrow and Feranguis before thee, and decide impartially between them which is the most worthy of sovereignty. Let the wisest and the bravest only be thy successor to the throne of Persia. Kavus replied, The father has no choice among his children. He loves them all alike. His only care is to prevent disunion, to preserve brotherly kindness and respect among them. After a pause, he requested the attendance of Feranguis and Khosrow, and told them that there was a demon fortress in the vicinity of his dominions called Bahman, from which fire was continually issuing. Go, each of you, said he, against this fortress, supported by an army with which you shall be equally provided, and the conqueror shall be sovereign of Persia. Feranguis was not sorry to hear of this probationary scheme, and only solicited to be sent first on the expedition. He and Tus looked upon the task as perfectly easy, and promised to be back triumphant in a short time. But when the army reached that awful fort, The ground seemed all in flames on every side. One universal fire raged round and round, and the hot wind was like the scorching breath which issues from red furnaces, where spirits infernal dwell. Full many a warrior brave, and many a soldier perished in that heat, consumed to ashes. Nearer to the fort, advancing, they beheld it in mid-air, but not a living thing, nor gate nor door. Yet they remained 1 week, hoping to find some hidden inlet, suffering cruel loss hour after hour. But none they could descry. At length, despairing, they returned, worn out, scorched, and half dead with watching, care, and toil. And thus, Feranguis and Tus, discomfited and sad, appeared before the Persian king. Then it was Khosrow's turn, and him Kavus dispatched with Giv and Gudaz, and the troops appointed for that enterprise, and blessed them. When the young prince approached the destined scene of his exploit, he saw the blazing fort, reddening the sky and earth, and well he knew this was the work of sorcery, the spell of demon spirits. In a heavenly dream, he had been taught how to destroy the charms of fell magicians, and defy their power, though by the devil himself, sustained. He wrote the name of God, and piously bound it upon his javelin's point, and pressed fearlessly forward, showing it on high, and Giv displayed it on the magic walls of that proud fortress, breathing forth a prayer craving the aid of the almighty arm, when suddenly the red fires died away, and all the world was darkness. Khosrow's troops, following the orders of their prince, then shot thick clouds of arrows from 10,000 bows in the direction of the enchanted tower. The arrows fell like rain, and quickly slew a host of demons. Presently, bright light dispelled the gloom, and as the mist rolled off in sulphury circles, the surviving fiends were seen in rapid flight. The fortress, too, distinctly shone, and its prodigious gate through which the conquerors passed. Great wealth they found, and having sacked the place, Khosrow erected a lofty temple to commemorate his name and victory there, then back returned triumphantly to gladden King Kavus, whose heart expanded at the joyous news. The result of Khosrow's expedition against the enchanted castle, compared with that of Feranguis, was sufficient of itself to establish the former in the king's estimation, and accordingly it was announced to the princes and nobles and warriors of the land that he should succeed to the throne, and be crowned on a fortunate day. A short time afterwards, the coronation took place with great pomp and splendour, and Khosrow conducted himself towards men of every rank and station with such perfect kindness and benevolence that he gained the affections of all, and never failed daily to pay a visit to his grandfather Kavus, and to familiarize himself with the affairs of the kingdom which he was destined to govern. Justice he spread with equal hand, rooting oppression from the land, and every desert, wood, and wild with early cultivation smiled, and every plain with verdure clad, and every Persian heart was glad.